The Soviet Union was more than just a country. It was a huge empire that stretched across 11 time zones, from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Its land covered 1/6 of the Earth's surface, home to millions of people from over 100 different ethnic groups. The main government in Moscow controlled every part of life, from how money was made to what art was created. The USSR was a global superpower, locked in a Cold War rivalry with the United States. It led the Warsaw Pact, controlling Eastern Europe through military might and its way of thinking. The state promised equality and good times under its communist ideas, but the truth often fell short. Factories, farms, and businesses were all owned by the state. Private ownership was almost unheard of. The Communist Party had total power, using propaganda to show a picture of unity and strength. Red flags and statues of Lenin were symbols of the government, but daily life was tough, and things were often hard to find. The system's promise of a workers' paradise was being ruined by growing problems and unhappiness. Underneath it all, the foundations of the empire were getting weaker. The state's power was huge, but its ability to provide for its people was shrinking. The image of being united hid deep divisions and growing cracks. The problems within the Soviet Union were becoming impossible to ignore. The world saw a superpower. Its people saw a system falling apart. The stage was set for a huge change. Between the 70s and the early 80s, the Soviet Union was stuck. The economy, run by the government, failed. This led to shortages and long lines for basic goods. Life got worse, and the promise of everyone being equal faded as the Communist Party leaders enjoyed special treatment. Alcoholism went way up, people weren't living as long, and everyone became cynical. The expensive arms race with the United States used up a lot of money, and the war in Afghanistan became a big problem. Young soldiers were dying in a fight the government tried to keep secret. The leaders were old and out of touch. Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, each one showed how things were falling apart. The country was just limping along, unable to fix its deep problems. Regular people lost faith in the system. The empire was sick, and the old ways of fixing things just weren't working anymore. Change had to happen. The Soviet Union's time was running out. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader, determined to save the Soviet Union through reforms. He started Perestroika, which was about fixing the economy, and Glasnost, which meant openness and freedom to speak. Small private businesses popped up, and factory managers got some freedom. But people fought against the changes, which often made things like shortages and confusion even worse. Glasnost caused a wave of criticism and showed how messed up the system was. Newspapers printed government scandals, banned books and movies came back. People spoke openly for the first time, and old national identities that had been hidden came back to life. Ethnic groups all over the USSR started asking for recognition and rights. The Communist Party lost its control over what was true and how things were run. Gorbachev hoped to fix the system, but his changes set off forces he couldn't control. The Soviet Union was falling apart. The time for change had begun. Glasnost sparked a wave of nationalism in the Soviet republics. In the Baltics, millions formed the Baltic Way, a human chain demanding independence. Lithuania declared independence in 1990, inspiring others despite threats from Moscow. Ethnic tensions exploded in the Caucasus, with violence in Georgia and conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh. The Central Asian republics asserted their own identities. Crucially, Russian nationalism grew under Boris Yeltsin, who challenged Soviet authority. Russian laws began to override Soviet ones, undermining the very core of the Union. The dream of a unified Soviet people was crumbling into competing nationalisms. The empire was unraveling at a dizzying speed. In the summer of 1991, the Soviet Union was on the brink. Hardline communists planned a coup to stop Gorbachev's changes and keep the old ways. Tanks rolled into Moscow, but the plotters hesitated and failed to arrest Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin called on citizens to resist. Thousands defended the Russian parliament. In a key moment, Yeltsin climbed onto a tank, telling soldiers to ignore illegal orders. The image became a worldwide symbol of resistance. The coup fell apart in 3 days, speeding up the Soviet Union's collapse. The old government's power was shattered. The people had chosen a new path. The end was now certain. Yeltsin's brave stand made him the face of a new Russia. The failed takeover broke the Communist Party's hold and the central government's power. Gorbachev came back, but he had lost his power. Yeltsin was now in charge, like a king returning, but without his old strength. One by one, the Soviet republics said they were independent, like breaking free from a heavy burden. Ukraine leaving was the final blow, the last nail in the coffin for the Union. The dream of a new union was dead, like a song with no ending. The Soviet Empire had come to an end, like an overseas empire falling apart. Power moved from Moscow to the republics, especially Russia, like the main hub of a new time. The world watched the start of a new time, like seeing a new chapter in history. The Soviet Union's days were numbered, its fate sealed like that of a falling empire. In December of 1991, the Soviet Union unraveled. Yeltsin, Kravchuk, and Shushkevich signed the Belovezh Accords, dissolving the USSR and forming the Commonwealth of Independent States. Gorbachev was sidelined, powerless to stop the breakup. On December 25th, Gorbachev resigned on national television. That night, the Soviet red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Russian tricolor replaced it, marking the end of an era. The Soviet Union, once a global superpower, vanished almost overnight. The Cold War was over. 15 new states emerged from the ruins of the empire. The world entered a new and uncertain era. Soviet history had come to an end. The Soviet collapse brought chaos and many hardships. Shock therapy reforms in Russia led to hyperinflation, joblessness, and the rise of oligarchs. Ordinary people faced poverty and uncertainty as the social safety net disappeared. Ethnic conflicts broke out in places like Chechnya and between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The former Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe embraced democracy and joined Western alliances. The threat of nuclear war lessened, but new instabilities arose. Nuclear weapons were brought together in Russia, but borders and identities were changing. The new states had to build governments, economies, and armies from scratch. The end of the empire was a beginning, chaotic, painful, and uncertain. The world was changed, but the shift was far from smooth. The effects of the Soviet collapse would shape the next decades. Decades later, the Soviet collapse still shapes global politics. In Russia, the 90s are remembered as a time of shame and chaos. This opened the door for Vladimir Putin, who promised to bring back order and power. Putin's policies aim to get back influence over the old Soviet republics, which has caused conflicts and tension. Wars in Chechnya, Georgia, Crimea, and Ukraine all come from old imperial problems that were never fixed. NATO expanding eastward is seen in Moscow as a threat, making the distrust with the West even deeper. The end of the Cold War brought hope, but also new rivalries and uncertainties. The Soviet collapse wasn't an end, but the start of a continuous change. Nationalism, economic problems, and changing power dynamics still have an impact today. Understanding the fall of the Soviet Union is key to understanding our world today. The fall of the Soviet Union wasn't just the end of a government. It was the closing of a whole chapter in world history. An empire that started with promises of fairness crumbled under the weight of harsh rule, money problems, and problems from within. Flags changed, leaders fell, but the effects of this collapse still shape wars, friendships, and rivalries even today. If an empire this big could disappear in just a few days, what else in our world might be about to fall apart without us even knowing? If you liked this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because here, you'll always find out how the behind the scenes of history shapes our present. See you next time.